I had been on patrol for years, mostly driving around city streets and quiet neighborhoods. But that week, they assigned me to help the forest rangers. A hiker had gone missing and they needed more people. I wasn't too excited about it, but orders were orders. The forest was thick, going on for miles. I parked my car at the edge, grabbed my stuff, and walked into the woods with a rough idea of where the hiker was last seen. The search team was spread out, each of us covering a different section. I was on my own, and at first I didn't mind. The trees were big and blocked most of the sunlight, which made everything cooler and quieter than I expected. I kept walking deeper, scanning the area with my flashlight as the sky started to get darker. After an hour, I realized something. It was too quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the type that makes your skin crawl. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps. I kept moving, telling myself it was just in my head. The forest was probably playing tricks on me. Then I found something. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, ripped at the heel. It looked old, worn out, like it had been here for a while. But it didn't look like it had been out in the woods long enough to be weathered. I picked it up, looked around, but there were no footprints, no path. It was just there. I walked further in and came across a campsite. What was left of it, anyway. A tent, torn up and collapsed. Stuff was scattered everywhere. I recognized some of the gear from the hikers' belongings, but it didn't make sense. It looked like someone had freaked out and left in a hurry. I figured maybe an animal came through and scared them, but there were no animal tracks, no signs of anything like that. No prints, no droppings, nothing. Something felt wrong, really wrong. I tried my radio, but it only gave me static. I messed with it a bit, but it was no use. The signal was dead. I stood there for a minute, uneasy, realizing how deep into the forest I had wandered without thinking. It was getting dark fast. I knew I should have turned back, but for some reason, I kept going. I don't know why. Maybe it was just curiosity or a bad feeling in my gut. Either way, I pressed on, feeling the tension build with every step. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. That's when I saw it. There was a hole in the ground, like someone had dug something up but covered it again in a rush. The dirt looked uneven, disturbed. I crouched down, brushed some of the loose dirt away, and saw it. A hand. Human. My stomach twisted. I jumped back, feeling a cold sweat break out. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew I had to report this. I tried the radio again, still nothing. The only thing I could do was go back the way I came and get to my car as fast as possible. As I turned to leave, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was another officer, but something was off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. But I knew someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I started walking quickly, trying to keep calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Every few steps, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving, keeping my eyes forward, focused on getting out. But the forest seemed different now. The paths looked strange, the trees felt closer together. My flashlight flickered, and I could feel panic setting in. After what felt like forever, I finally saw my car through the trees. I didn't waste any time. I ran the last few steps, jumped into the car, and slammed the doors shut. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what just happened. The forest was still quiet, but the air felt heavy, like something was waiting. I started the engine and pulled away. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know who or what it was. I left that forest, but something stayed with me. I filed my report, told them about the campsite and the hand I found. But I didn't mention the figure. No one would believe me anyway. They never found the hiker, and I never went back to that forest. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure standing there, watching me. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, and if one day someone else will wander in too far, and they won't be as lucky as I was to make it out. I was hiking in a forest I hadn't been to before. It was late September, and the air was cool. The leaves were just starting to turn yellow and orange. I planned a simple hike, just to clear my mind for a few hours. I wasn't looking for anything exciting, just some quiet. But quiet was the last thing I got. The trail was easy to follow at first, wide and well-marked. But after a couple of hours, it started to get smaller. I had the GPS on my phone, and I wasn't worried since I brought a power bank with me. The map showed a stream nearby, so I kept walking. But I never found the stream. The more I walked, the more the trail seemed to disappear. I soon realized I was surrounded by thick trees, and the sun was starting to go down. I could have turned back, but something about it made me feel like giving up would be the wrong move. So I kept going, even though I hadn't seen another person for hours. My phone still worked, but the GPS started acting strange. The map kept moving my location around, the little dot jumping from one place to another, sometimes completely off the trail. I thought I was heading back to where I parked, but after walking what felt like forever, I ended up in a part of the forest I didn't know. The trees were taller, older, and it was strangely quiet. No wind, no birds, just nothing. My phone lost its signal completely. I tried using the compass on it, but it just spun around in circles. That's when I saw it. Through the trees, maybe about 50 yards away, I spotted an old cabin. The wood was dark, rotting in places, and the roof was caving in. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was no way it was on the map. I didn't remember seeing any buildings marked. I told myself it could be an old ranger's cabin or maybe some kind of emergency shelter. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Why would there be a cabin out here so far from any main trail? Still, with the sun going down, I figured it was better than nothing. I slowly walked toward it, trying to keep calm, even though everything inside me was screaming to get away. The door was slightly open. Inside, it was darker than it should have been, even though there was still some daylight left outside. I stepped in, and the smell hit me. Wet wood and something rotten. My stomach turned. There wasn't much inside. No furniture, nothing that showed anyone had lived there for a long time. Just an empty wooden floor and a fireplace filled with ash. But then, in the far corner, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints. They were in the dust, leading to a back room. The door to that room was cracked open, just like the front door had been. I stood there, frozen, realizing someone had been in here. Recently, I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who could have left those prints, and why they were still here. What scared me the most was the silence. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no creaking floor, nothing. Slowly, I backed out of the cabin, trying not to make any noise. The air outside felt colder now, heavier. My heart was pounding, and every little sound around me felt louder. Leaves crunching under my boots, branches rustling above me. As I tried to find my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The trees felt closer, like they were pressing in. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. At least I thought I didn't. The light was almost gone by now. I picked up my pace, trying to keep calm, but I couldn't help it. Panic was crawling up my spine. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. My phone still had no signal, and for some reason, the battery was draining way faster than it should have been. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a branch snap behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't want to turn around. My breath caught in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to know what made that noise. I didn't want to see what or who was following me. I started moving again, faster this time, still not looking back. My only thought was to get out of that forest. I finally saw the parking lot through the trees. I was exhausted, my legs felt like they were on fire, and my chest was tight, but I didn't stop. I ran the last part, barely making it to my car before I collapsed. I sat there for a while, catching my breath, before I dared to glance back at the forest. There was nothing there, no cabin, no one following me, just the trees standing still and quiet. But something was wrong. The quiet wasn't normal. It was the same eerie silence from before. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. I don't know what I walked into that day, and I don't care to find out. But there's one thing I do know for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. And whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. Something followed me out, and I think it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. It was a chilly, gray afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the forest behind my house. My neighbor, Tim, had once mentioned a trail that went deep into the woods, one that wasn't marked on any map. Tim had always been a little odd, kept to himself, didn't say much, but I figured he knew these woods better than anyone else. I'd seen him walk into them plenty of times, always by himself. I started walking through the trees, following what looked like a faint trail. The farther I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of birds and the wind rustling the leaves were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I told myself it was just because I was farther away from the road, but it still felt strange. The air was getting colder, the trees were growing closer together, and the light above was starting to fade as the clouds thickened. After what felt like forever, I stumbled across something odd. There was a small clearing, and in the middle was a fire pit, long burned out. Around it were logs set in a circle like people had sat there recently. I felt a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe other hikers or Tim had been here before. But then, something else caught my eye. A big pile of sticks and branches, stacked into a rough shelter at the edge of the clearing. I stood there, staring at it. It didn't look like the kind of shelter someone would make for camping. It was messy, poorly built, and didn't even have a door. It seemed more like a place someone would hide in. I walked closer to take a look inside. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I noticed something strange. Buried halfway under the leaves and dirt was a shoe. A man's boot, old and covered in mud, but still in good shape. It didn't seem like something someone would just leave behind. Suddenly, I got this awful feeling, like I was being watched. My skin crawled, and I quickly spun around, scanning the trees. No one was there, but that feeling didn't go away. My gut was telling me to leave, but I stood there, stuck, staring at the boot and the quiet clearing around me. Something was off, and it wasn't just the shoe. It was everything. It felt wrong, like I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the forest, and hurried back to where I thought the path was. But the farther I walked, the more I realized I didn't know where I was. The trees all looked the same, and the trail seemed to vanish into the underbrush. I started walking faster, hoping I'd find something familiar soon. Then, off in the distance, I saw someone moving through the trees. My first thought was Tim. Maybe he was out here checking his traps or doing whatever it was he did in the woods. I started following him, moving quickly toward where I saw him disappear. But every time I got closer, The figure slipped deeper into the forest, just out of sight. I kept chasing after him, but something didn't feel right. He never turned around, never slowed down, like he didn't hear me at all. It almost felt like he was leading me deeper into the woods on purpose. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I finally stopped, breathing hard, and realized I had no idea where I was. The figure was gone. I was alone, lost, and the temperature was dropping fast. My chest tightened with panic as I spun around, trying to retrace my steps. But there were no signs, no trail to follow. The trees were thick, and the silence was overwhelming. Then I saw it again, the shelter, the same one from earlier with the fire pit and the logs in a circle. Somehow, even though I hadn't been walking in circles, I ended up back there. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't just lost. Something was wrong. Something was leading me back to this place. I forced myself to walk past the clearing, not looking back at the shelter. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks as I pushed through the trees, desperate to find my way out. Every sound made me jump, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the edge of the forest and my house beyond it. As I stepped out of the woods, I glanced back one last time. Standing just inside the tree line at the edge of the clearing was Tim. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. His face was blank, but his eyes were cold, like he had been waiting for me to leave. It wasn't relief I felt. It was something far worse. I never went back into those woods after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Tim. Every now and then, I'd catch him watching me from his yard, his gaze lingering just a little too long. But it wasn't just his stare that bothered me. It was what I saw the next day. I was walking past his house when I noticed something leaning against his front porch. It was the same boot I'd found in the shelter, cleaned up, polished even, and beside it another pair. I stopped walking, staring at them for a moment, then hurried home. I locked my doors that night and kept the curtains closed. Whatever Tim was doing out in those woods, I didn't want to know. But now, every time I hear a twig snap in the woods behind my house, I wonder if he's still out there, and if he's waiting for me to follow him again. I've always liked hiking by myself. There's something about being out there, just me and the quiet of the forest. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the wind and the trees. So, when I got a long weekend off work, I decided to head to a forest about 2 hours away. I'd been there before, but I wanted to try a trail that went further into the woods. It wasn't on most maps, but I'd read about it online, and I figured it would be nice to explore. The first few hours were calm. Birds were chirping, leaves rustling under my boots, and the trail was easy to follow. I kept walking, feeling more relaxed the deeper I went. I hadn't seen anyone all day, but that didn't bother me. I liked being alone out there. By the afternoon, I found a small clearing with a stream running through it. I sat on a big rock near the water, had a snack, and just listened. The forest was so still. I could hear every drop of water hitting the rocks in the stream. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After resting for a bit, I got back on the trail. But as I walked, something felt off. The air felt heavier, like something was out there with me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone. But that feeling didn't go away. The further I went, the thicker the trees got. The path started getting harder to see, covered with leaves and branches. I started looking for the markers other hikers had left. Pieces of cloth tied to trees or little marks cut into the bark. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen any of those markers for a long time. I stopped and looked around, but everything looked the same, just trees in every direction. It hit me then, I was lost. I turned around, trying to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every twist in the path felt like I'd already seen it. I pulled out my map, but the trail I was on wasn't even on it. I checked my phone, no signal. That's when the panic started to creep in. I hadn't seen another person all day, and I wasn't sure anyone knew I had taken this trail. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The light turned orange, making the forest look strange and twisted. I started walking faster, trying to stay calm, but every few minutes, I thought I heard something behind me. A branch snapping, leaves crunching. I'd stop and listen, but it would be quiet again, like nothing was there. The sky kept getting darker, and the forest felt more and more threatening. Every sound seemed louder, and every shadow felt like it was moving. I walked even faster, then started to jog, hoping I'd find my way out soon. That's when I saw it, a cabin. It wasn't on the map, but there it was, hidden among the trees, old and worn down. The windows were dark, and the door was cracked open. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I could stay there until morning, or maybe there would be something inside to help me find my way back. But as I got closer, that heavy feeling came back. The air around the cabin felt wrong. It looked like no one had been there for years, but the door was slightly open, like someone had just been there. I stood there for a moment, deciding if I should go in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel right, but it was getting dark, and I didn't have many options. Just as I was about to step closer, I saw something move in the trees behind the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it was too fast. My heart started pounding. I backed away from the cabin, scanning the trees, trying to see what was out there. Then I saw it again. This time it was closer. A figure, human-shaped but too quick, moving between the trees like it was watching me. It wasn't coming toward me, but it was circling, like it was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and ran, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The darkness made it hard to see, but I didn't care. My breathing was loud and heavy, but I just kept running, trying to get away from whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran, but after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto the main trail. I recognized the signs, the familiar markers. I felt a wave of relief, but I didn't stop. I kept going, not daring to look back. By the time I reached the clearing near the parking lot, it was well after midnight. I collapsed there, breathing hard, my legs burning, but too scared to look back into the trees. Whatever was out there, it had followed me for miles. I could feel it. I didn't camp that night. I walked straight to my car and drove off. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and I've never gone back. But sometimes late at night I think about it, about how I never heard it behind me, even when I knew it was there, about how fast it moved, too fast to be human. Whatever was out there wasn't meant to be seen. It was something that belonged deep in the forest, far away from people. And now, when I close my eyes, I see it sometimes, still watching me. It never really left. My stepbrother and I were hiking deep into the forest. He's always been the outdoorsy type, always making me go with him on these trips. This time, he talked me into going farther than we ever had, into a part of the woods we hadn't been to before. The trees were thick, and the more we walked, the more it felt like we were really cut off. There were no sounds from the road, no distant noises from cars or anything. Just quiet, with the occasional rustling of leaves from animals we couldn't see. We followed a narrow path that looked like no one had used it in years. The air felt colder the deeper we went, and the sunlight barely made it through the trees above us. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured my stepbrother knew where he was going. He always acted like he did, and I just went along with it. After a while, though, something started to feel wrong. I couldn't quite figure out what it was at first, but the forest started feeling different. It was too quiet now. No barges, no wind, no rustling. Just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaves. We kept going even though the path seemed to vanish. My stepbrother kept looking back at me, like he was checking if I was okay. But he didn't say anything. Eventually, I started feeling uneasy. Every direction looked the same. The trees were all identical, and there were no landmarks, no way of knowing if we were still on the right track or not. At some point, my stepbrother stopped. He pointed ahead, but all I saw were more trees. Then I noticed something on the ground. The dirt looked like it had been dug up recently. There was a small hole partly covered by leaves. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a dog, but something about it made my stomach turn. It looked fresh, too fresh to have been there long. My stepbrother didn't say anything, but I could tell he was weirded out too. We both knew this wasn't normal. Without saying a word, we decided to turn around and head back. But as we did, the air felt different, felt heavier, like it was harder to breathe. I started feeling like someone was nearby, watching us. It wasn't just in my head. Felt real. We started walking faster, not saying a word. The path on the way back didn't look the same. It was like the trees had moved, or maybe we were just more lost than we realized. My chest was tight, and I could feel my heart pounding, but we didn't stop. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like something was just behind us, keeping pace. After what felt like forever, we finally saw the edge of the forest. I felt a bit of relief, but just as we were about to step out, I heard it, a twig snapping behind us. I didn't want to look, but I knew my stepbrother heard it too because he broke into a run. I followed right behind him, too scared to turn around and see what it was. We made it to the car, both of us gasping for air. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. As we sat there, trying to catch our breath, I glanced back at the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. There was a shape standing just behind the tree line, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. We didn't talk about it on the way home. Neither of us wanted to admit something was wrong, but we both knew we had come across something we shouldn't have. Something that shouldn't have been out there. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Every little sound outside made me jump. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something outside my window, a soft, steady tapping, like fingers lightly drumming on the glass. I didn't look, but I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in those woods had followed us home. It had found me, and it wasn't going away. I set out for a hike in the old forest, a place I'd heard about since I was a kid. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. I knew the trail, but it had been a while since I'd last walked it. The forest was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. I moved on, with only the crunch of leaves and sticks underfoot breaking the silence. The trees seemed to lean in, as if they were whispering about me. I tried to shake off the weird feeling, thinking it was just the dense, old forest playing tricks on me. But the deeper I went, the heavier the forest felt, pressing in on me. Around noon, I found a small clearing with an old, falling-apart cabin. It looked abandoned and beaten down, with ivy climbing up its sides and a drooping roof. It was a creepy sight, but I was curious, so I went closer. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark, musty inside. I peeked in but decided not to go further. I kept going, noticing how the forest seemed to get darker, with shadows stretching out in odd ways. When I started heading back, the trail didn't seem as familiar. I looked around and realized the forest was no longer a place I recognized. The path was twisted, and the trees seemed to have moved, hiding the landmarks I knew. Panic started to creep in. I picked up my pace, trying to retrace my steps. My heart raced as I stumbled through the thick underbrush, completely lost. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The air grew colder, and I had the unsettling feeling of being watched. I struggled to stay calm, knowing I needed to if I wanted to get out. As twilight began to settle, I saw a faint light through the trees. I pushed through the dense undergrowth and stumbled onto a part of the trail I recognized. I followed it quickly and finally reached the edge of the forest just as it got dark. I was relieved to see the open field and my car parked on the roadside. I glanced back at the forest, now just a dark shape in the distance. My experience had left me rattled, but I was out. The forest's secrets were still hidden, but one thing was clear. It was not a place to mess around with. The way back had been tougher to find than I expected, and the forest seemed almost to have a will of its own, trying to keep me inside. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time, something that didn't want me to leave. The trees had seemed to close in as I left, and the shadows seemed to move just a bit too quickly. It was like the forest had been holding its breath, waiting for me to wander too far. I knew I would never return to that place again, but the sense of being followed stayed with me long after I was safely home. I was hiking alone in the thick forests of the Black Forest in Germany, far off the beaten path. The tall, old trees created a dense cover overhead, letting only small patches of sunlight through. I'd come to escape the busy tourist spots and enjoy some quiet time. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds and rustling leaves, slowly disappeared until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle when I saw something strange. A small clearing, once hidden by bushes, was now visible. It looked like someone had recently cleared the area. Feeling curious, I walked into the clearing. It looked too neat, almost unnervingly so. In the middle was a large, shallow pit, surrounded by disturbed soil and broken branches. My gut told me to leave, but I felt drawn to investigate the pit. As I crouched near it, I saw several pieces of old, stained cloth scattered around. A chill went down my spine, not from the cold but from the realization that this pit seemed like it was used to hide or bury something or someone. I stood up quickly, feeling a heavy weight of unease. The forest now felt stifling, and the silence around me felt unnervingly loud. I turned to leave, but my heart raced when I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. Panic set in. I started walking fast, then broke into a run. The feeling of being watched, of something following me, grew stronger with every step. The forest seemed to close in, and the sunlight that peeked through the trees felt faint and distant. Eventually, I broke out of the thick underbrush and saw the trailhead in the distance. I ran the last stretch, not stopping until I was safely back in the parking lot. I didn't look back. When I got home, I checked the news and saw reports about several people who had gone missing in that forest over the past few months, with no leads on their whereabouts. The thought of what I'd found in that clearing, coupled with those reports, was unsettling. That day, the Black Forest showed me its dark side. The eerie silence and the feeling of being followed lingered. It made me realize that sometimes there are parts of our world that are best left unexplored, and sometimes the things we stumble upon are better left unknown.